There are stories that the world decided not to remember, not because the evidence was lost, not because the witnesses were too few or the documentation too thin, but because the political circumstances of the moment made remembering inconvenient. Because the nations with the power to acknowledge what happened had reasons, strategic reasons, diplomatic reasons, economic reasons to look away. And because looking away, when done consistently enough by enough powerful people for enough decades, eventually becomes the official version of events. The Pontic Greeks are one of those stories, nearly 3,000 years. That is how long Greeks had been living on the southern coast of the Black Sea, the region the ancient Greeks called Pontus, the land of the sea, since before Alexander the Great, since before Rome, since the age when Greek city-states were planting colonies across the Mediterranean and Black Sea worlds, and one of those colonies took root on a coastline in what is now northern Turkey and stayed there. Through the rise and fall of the Byzantine Empire, through the Ottoman conquest, through 4 centuries of Ottoman rule that restricted and taxed and sometimes persecuted, but ultimately permitted the survival of a Greek community that kept its language, its faith, its identity, its memory of what it was and where it came from across more than 100 generations, nearly 3,000 years. Between 1914 and 1923, the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish nationalist government that succeeded it systematically destroyed that community through deportations, through forced labor battalions, through massacres, through death marches into the Anatolian interior that killed not through direct violence alone, but through starvation and exposure and disease and the specific brutality of forcing elderly people and children to walk hundreds of miles through mountain terrain in conditions that made survival impossible by design. The death toll is estimated at 353,000 Pontic Greeks. Some historians place it higher. The uncertainty itself is part of the crime, because a genocide that is not documented, not acknowledged, not named, does not generate the kind of precise record-keeping that allows posterity to count its dead. 353,000 people. The world called it something else. A population transfer, a consequence of war. A tragic but inevitable result of the collision between Greek and Turkish nationalisms. It called it almost everything except what it was. This is the story the world decided not to remember, and the reason why, on May 19th every year, Greeks around the world remember it themselves. To understand what happened to the Pontic Greeks, you need to understand who they were, not as a historical abstraction, as a people. Pontus is a specific place. It runs along the southern coast of the Black Sea, modern-day northern Turkey, the provinces of Trabzon, Samsun, Ordu, Giresun, Rize. The terrain is dramatic, steep mountains, rising almost directly from the coastline, deep river valleys cutting through forested ranges, a climate defined by the sea on one side and the Anatolian plateau on the other. It is not easy terrain. It is the kind of terrain that isolates communities, that makes communication difficult, that creates the conditions for distinct local cultures to develop and persist over centuries. The Greeks who settled in Pontus in antiquity built cities that became significant centers of commerce and culture in the ancient world. Trapezus, modern Trabzon, was founded as a Greek colony around 756 BC. It became one of the most important ports on the Black Sea, a trading hub connecting the Greek world to the Caucasus, to Persia, to the interior of Anatolia. When Alexander the Great's empire collapsed, a Greek kingdom, the Kingdom of Pontus, emerged in the region and produced one of the most formidable enemies Rome ever faced, Mithridates VI, the king who fought Rome for decades and whose story fills volumes of ancient history that most people have never read. When Rome finally absorbed Pontus, when Byzantium rose and fell, when the Ottomans came, the Greeks remained, not unchanged, not unaffected by the centuries of political transformation around them, but present, maintaining their language, a dialect of Greek that preserved ancient elements lost in mainland Greek, that developed its own distinct character over centuries of relative isolation, that is today recognized as one of the most archaic surviving forms of the Greek language, maintaining their orthodox faith, maintaining the specific cultural practices, the music, the dance, the food, the family structures that made Pontic Greek identity distinct even from other Greek communities. When people say Pontic Greek, they are not describing an ethnic subgroup in the political sense. They are describing a civilization, a continuous human culture that persisted in the same geographic location for nearly 3,000 years through everything that history threw at it. Everything, that is, until the 20th century. The process that destroyed the Pontic Greek community did not begin in 1914 with a single decision or a single order. It began with a transformation in Ottoman political culture that had been building for decades. The rise of Turkish nationalism within the framework of the Ottoman Empire, the emergence of the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turks, as the dominant political force after the 1908 revolution, and the adoption within that movement of a vision of Anatolia as a Turkish homeland from which non-Turkish populations needed to be removed. The vision was not immediately or uniformly genocidal. It began as a program of Turkification, economic pressure, legal discrimination, forced migration of Greek populations away from strategically sensitive coastlines. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, in which the Ottoman Empire lost most of its European territory, accelerated the process by producing hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees who needed to be resettled, and by intensifying the nationalist conviction that the Ottoman state's survival required the removal of communities whose loyalties were considered suspect. The Greek community of Pontus was considered suspect because it was Greek, because it maintained connections, religious, cultural, sometimes commercial, with the Greek state, because the coastline it inhabited was strategically sensitive for a naval power, and the Greeks of Pontus were concentrated along that coastline, because in the logic of ethnic nationalism that was increasingly driving Ottoman policy, a Greek community in Anatolia was an anomaly that the new order could not accommodate. Chrysanthos of Trebizond understood what was coming before most of his community did. He was born in 1881 in Komotini, in Thrace, a Greek community in the northeastern corner of the Greek world, a place that understood what it meant to live at the edge of empires. He was educated at the Theological School of Halki, the great institution of orthodox theological learning on an island in the Sea of Marmara that had produced generations of church leadership. He was appointed Metropolitan of Trebizond in 1913, the spiritual leader of the largest Greek Orthodox community in Pontus, responsible for the churches and schools and charitable institutions that formed the institutional backbone of Greek life in the region. He arrived in Trebizond in 1913 and immediately began documenting what he saw, not because he knew then how complete the destruction would be, but because he was a man of careful intelligence who understood that the political trajectory of the Ottoman Empire was moving in a direction that his community needed to prepare for. He kept records, he wrote reports, he maintained correspondence with church leadership in Constantinople and with Greek government officials. He built, quietly and methodically, the documentary record that would eventually constitute some of the most important evidence of what happened to the Pontic Greeks. He was going to need it. 1914. The First World War begins. The Ottoman Empire enters the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary in October 1914. The decision transforms the situation of Christian minorities throughout the empire with a speed and completeness that even those who had been watching the political trajectory could not fully anticipate. The logic of the transformation is brutal and direct. The Ottoman government, dominated by the Committee of Union and Progress, led by the triumvirate of Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha, has decided that the war provides both the justification and the cover for the resolution of what it calls the minority problem. The Armenian genocide begins in April 1915. The systematic deportation and massacre of Armenian communities across Anatolia establishes the template and demonstrates that the template works, that the international community, preoccupied with the war in Europe, will not intervene effectively regardless of what the evidence shows. The Greeks of Pontus are not initially subjected to the same immediate violence as the Armenians. The Ottoman government is aware that Greece is neutral in the war, a neutrality that could tip either way, and that provoking Greek outrage through visible atrocities against the Pontic community could push Greece toward the Allies. So the destruction of the Pontic Greek community in the early war years takes a different form. Not immediate massacre, something slower and in some ways more methodical. The Amile Tabulari, the labor battalions, Greek men of military age throughout Pontus, men between the ages of roughly 15 and 50, are conscripted not into the Ottoman military but into labor battalions. They are sent to work on roads, railways, mines, fortifications in the Anatolian interior. The work is brutal. The conditions are designed to kill. The men are given inadequate food, inadequate clothing for the mountain winters, inadequate shelter. They work until they cannot work anymore, and then they are left where they fall, or shot, or simply abandoned. The labor battalions kill without the political visibility of massacre. There are no mass graves that international observers can point to. There are no photographs of execution sites. There are men who left their villages in Pontus to report for labor service and never came back, whose families received no information about where they were or what happened to them, whose deaths were distributed across the Anatolian interior in ways that made them individually invisible even as they were collectively catastrophic. Chrysanthos begins receiving reports from across his diocese, families whose fathers and husbands and sons have been taken and not returned, villages where the male population of working age has been effectively eliminated, communities that are being systematically stripped of the people who would be capable of organized resistance to whatever comes next. He writes to Constantinople. He writes to the Greek government. He writes to international relief organizations. He documents names, numbers, locations. He builds the record with the methodical precision of a man who understands that the record may be the only thing that survives. The war continues. The labor battalions continue. And in 1916, something changes. Russian forces advancing through eastern Anatolia reach the Pontic coast and occupy Trabzon in April 1916. For the Greek community of Trabzon, the Russian occupation brings a temporary reprieve. The immediate threat of Ottoman violence is suspended, and some of the Greek community welcomes the Russian forces as potential liberators. The reprieve lasts less than 2 years. The Russian Revolution of 1917 collapses the Eastern Front. Russian forces withdraw from Anatolia. The Ottoman government returns to Trebizond, and now there is no restraint at all. The deportations begin in earnest in 1916 and accelerate through 1917 and 1918. Greek communities throughout Pontus are ordered to leave, not to relocate to nearby towns, to march into the interior, into the mountains of central Anatolia, into regions where there is no infrastructure to support the survival of the people being sent there, where the distances from the coast are measured in weeks of walking, where the weather in winter kills people who are adequately clothed and fed. The Pontic Greeks being deported are not adequately clothed or fed. They are given hours to gather what they can carry. They leave behind houses, farms, businesses, churches, schools, cemeteries, everything that nearly 3,000 years of continuous habitation had built. They walk into the mountains. Many of them do not come back. The death marches into the interior, the columns of deportees moving through mountain terrain, in winter without adequate food or shelter, kill through a combination of factors that the perpetrators understand perfectly and the victims can do almost nothing about: starvation, exposure, disease, particularly typhus, which spreads rapidly through weakened populations in the conditions the marches create, violence by irregular forces, the bands of armed men who operate in the gaps between official Ottoman military authority and whose attacks on deportee columns are sometimes tolerated and sometimes encouraged by local officials. Chrysanthos documents what he can. He receives reports from priests and community leaders throughout his diocese as long as communication remains possible. He sends what documentation he can to Constantinople and through diplomatic channels to the outside world. He appeals to Ottoman authorities. He appeals to German military advisors whose influence within the Ottoman government he correctly identifies as potentially significant. He appeals to anyone who might intervene. The appeals produce almost nothing. The German military advisors are aware of what is happening and choose not to intervene decisively because the Ottoman military alliance is more important to German war aims than the survival of Greek communities in Pontus. The Ottoman authorities respond to his documentation with bureaucratic deflection. The deportations are a military necessity. The labor battalions are required for the war effort. The situation will improve. The reports he is receiving are exaggerated. They are not exaggerated. They are, if anything, incomplete. In the villages of Pontus that have not yet been deported, the remaining population watches the columns of their neighbors leave and understands what watching means. The women and children and elderly who remain after the men have been taken to labor battalions try to maintain the farms and businesses and community institutions that define their existence. They try to keep the schools open. They try to keep the churches functioning. They try to maintain the normal structures of life under conditions that are systematically destroying the basis of that life. Some of them flee into the mountains. The Pontic Mountains, the ranges that rise steeply from the coast into the interior, provide a refuge of sorts for communities that have the physical capability to reach them and the resources to survive there. Bands of Greek resistance fighters, the Andatis, form in the mountains, protecting refugee communities and conducting operations against Ottoman forces where the terrain allows. The resistance is real and in some areas significant. It does not change the strategic outcome. It saves some lives. It cannot save enough. The war ends in October 1918 with the Armistice of Mudros. The Ottoman Empire is defeated. The Committee of Union and Progress government collapses. Enver, Talat, and Cemal flee the country. The Allied powers occupy Constantinople. International tribunals are convened to try Ottoman officials for war crimes, including the crimes against the Armenian and Greek communities of Anatolia. Chrysanthos goes to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 as a representative of the Pontic Greek community. He presents documentation. He presents testimony. He presents the case for international recognition of what happened and for the protection of the surviving Pontic Greek community. He is heard. He is not heeded. The political circumstances of 1919 and 1920 are not favorable to the recognition of what happened to the Pontic Greeks. The Allied powers are trying to manage the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in ways that serve their strategic interests. Britain, France, and Italy are dividing Ottoman territory among themselves and among their clients. The Greek landing at Smyrna in May 1919, authorized by the Allies to block Italian expansion, transforms the situation in Anatolia from a post-war settlement into an active military conflict. And then Mustafa Kemal emerges from the Anatolian interior with a nationalist movement that refuses the peace terms. The Greco-Turkish War begins. The world's attention moves from the crimes of the Ottoman government to the military confrontation between Greece and the Turkish nationalist forces. The Pontic Greeks, who have already lost hundreds of thousands of their community to the labor battalions and the death marches of the war years, find themselves caught between two military forces in a conflict that they did not start and cannot control. The nationalist forces under Kemal continue and intensify the deportations. Greek communities in Pontus that survived the war years are now subjected to renewed violence, this time from forces that are fighting the Greek state and that treat the Pontic Greek community as enemy civilians regardless of their actual relationship to the distant conflict on the Aegean coast. The death marches continue. The labor battalions continue. The killings in the mountains continue. By 1923, when the Treaty of Lausanne formalized the population exchange between Greece and Turkey, the Pontic Greek community that had existed for nearly 3,000 years had been effectively destroyed. The survivors, those who reached Greece in the population exchange, those who had fled to Russia and the Caucasus during the war years, those who had somehow survived the death marches, carried with them the memory of a world that no longer existed. 353,000 of their community had not survived to carry anything. Most people will never hear this story. They'll go their whole lives not knowing what happened here. If that bothers you, if you think the silence around these moments is wrong, subscribe to this channel. We're filling that silence one video at a time. And if this story deserved to be told, hit that like button. It takes 1 second. The failure of international recognition of the Pontic Greek genocide is not a simple story of world indifference. It is a story of active political choices made by powerful nations that had specific reasons to minimize or ignore what happened. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, the treaty that formalized the population exchange, was negotiated between the Allied powers and the Turkish nationalist government in a context that made acknowledgement of genocide politically inconvenient. The Allied powers needed a stable relationship with the new Turkish Republic. Britain had strategic interests in the region. France had signed a separate peace with Kemal in 1921. The United States, while not a party to the treaty, had commercial and diplomatic interests in Turkey that its representative at Lausanne, Rear Admiral Mark Bristol, consistently prioritized over the concerns of the Greek and Armenian communities. The Ottoman war crimes tribunals that had been convened after the armistice in 1919 and 1920, tribunals that had actually indicted and convicted several officials for crimes against Armenian and Greek communities, were effectively abandoned as the political winds shifted toward accommodation of the Turkish nationalist government. The convictions were never enforced. The convicted officials, including some of the architects of the deportation policies, were either already in exile or were released. The historical record was not destroyed, it was buried. The documentation that Chrysanthos compiled, the reports of international relief organizations, the testimony of survivors, the diplomatic cables of Allied representatives who witnessed the deportations and massacres, all of it exists. It has been available to historians. It has been cited in academic works. It has formed the basis of recognition by scholars who have examined it carefully. What it has not consistently produced is official political recognition by the governments whose acknowledgement would carry the most weight in international discourse. Greece officially recognizes May 19th as the Day of Remembrance for the Pontic Greek Genocide. The Greek parliament designated this date, the anniversary of Kemal's landing at Samsun in 1919, which marked the beginning of the Turkish nationalist movement's final campaign against the Pontic Greek community as a national day of remembrance in 1994. Cyprus recognizes it. A number of individual states within the United States have passed resolutions of recognition. The International Association of Genocide Scholars has concluded that the events constitute genocide under the definition established by the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The Turkish government does not recognize it. The official Turkish position is that the deaths of Pontic Greeks during this period were the result of wartime conditions, intercommunal conflict, and disease, not systematic state policy aimed at the destruction of the community as such. The documents say otherwise. The testimony of survivors says otherwise. The scholarship of historians who have examined the evidence without political agenda says otherwise. The 353,000 dead say otherwise in the only language available to them, the language of their absence, the villages that are empty, the churches that are mosques or ruins, the cemeteries whose inscriptions have been removed or weathered away, the language that is spoken today only by the descendants of those who escaped, a language without a homeland, preserved in the diaspora communities of Greece and Australia and Germany and the United States and wherever else the survivors and their children and grandchildren ended up. Chrysanthos of Trebizond survived the genocide. He left Pontus during the population exchange. He was born in Komotini and had spent his adult life serving a community in Pontus, a community that no longer existed in its homeland by the time the exchange was complete. He eventually became Archbishop of Athens, serving from 1938 to 1941. He carried with him the documentation he had compiled throughout the genocide years and continued to advocate for recognition of what had happened to his community. He died in 1949. He had spent 30 years trying to make the world understand what he had witnessed and documented. He had been partially successful. The Greek state acknowledged the history. The Orthodox Church maintained the memory. The survivor communities built institutions that kept the story alive. He had not been successful in obtaining the international recognition that would have placed the Pontic genocide alongside other acknowledged genocides in the consciousness of the world. The survivors built new lives. The Pontic Greeks who arrived in Greece in the population exchange came to a country that was simultaneously overwhelmed with refugees and struggling to absorb the shock of the Asia Minor catastrophe. They settled in Thessaloniki, in Athens, in the cities of northern Greece. They brought with them the music, the distinctive Pontic lyra, the dances, the songs that carried the memory of a coastline most of them would never see again. They brought the language. They brought the recipes, the festivals, the religious practices, the specific way of being Greek that Pontus had produced over nearly 3,000 years. They built communities, they raised children, they told stories, sometimes to those who would listen carefully, incompletely, in the way that people tell stories about things too large to fully articulate. The grandchildren of survivors grew up knowing that something had happened to their family, that there was a world before Greece that had been taken from them, that the loss was real and permanent, and not adequately named by the world that should have named it. May 19th exists because of those grandchildren, because the survivor generation began to age, and the stories they carried began to be recognized as irreplaceable, because the Greek Parliament, in 1994, made the decision that the community's remembrance deserved official acknowledgement, because enough people decided that 353,000 dead deserved a day. The Pontic dialect is still spoken. There are communities in Greece, particularly in northern Greece, where it is maintained as a living language, where the specific vocabulary and grammar that developed over nearly 3,000 years of relative isolation on the Black Sea coast is still passed from grandparents to grandchildren. It is endangered. The number of fluent speakers decreases with each generation, but it has not yet disappeared. The music is still played. The Pontic lyra, a bowed instrument whose sound is unlike anything else in Greek musical tradition, whose tones carry something of the landscape that produced them, is played at festivals and community gatherings by musicians who learned from musicians who learned from musicians who carried the instrument out of Pontus. The dances are still danced. The food is still cooked. The names of the villages, Trebizond, Samsun, Kerasunt, Amisos, the hundreds of smaller communities that dotted the Pontic coast and its mountain hinterland, are still spoken by people whose grandparents were born in them. Nearly 3,000 years does not disappear when it is expelled from its homeland. It travels, it adapts, it survives in the specific gravity of a culture that knows what it lost and refuses to lose the memory of having lost it. 353,000 people did not survive to carry that memory. Their names are not on any international memorial. Their deaths are not acknowledged in the diplomatic language of the nations that had the power and chose not to use it. They exist in the records that Chrysanthos compiled at risk to himself, in the testimony of survivors preserved by researchers who understood that testimony was disappearing, in the archives of the Greek government and the Orthodox Church, in the family stories that have been passed down imperfectly and incompletely across 4 generations, and now in this video, watched by the descendants of the people this story is about, by people whose grandparents or great-grandparents walked out of Pontus carrying what they could and built new lives in a country that was not yet fully their home. If you are watching this and your family is from Pontus, if your grandmother spoke the dialect, if your grandfather danced the dances, if you grew up hearing the name of a village on the Black Sea coast that no longer has Greeks in it, this video is for you. This story is yours. It always was. The world forgot it. You don't have to. If you felt the weight of this story, that's history doing what it's supposed to do. That like button honors that feeling. Don't skip it. We carry these stories carefully, every fact verified, every name checked, every detail earned. If that standard matters to you, subscribe and help us maintain it. Where are you watching from? If your family has roots in Pontus, if you are a descendant of the community this video is about, tell us in the comments. Tell us where your family was from. Tell us what they carried out with them. These stories belong to the people who live them and to the people who carry them forward. We read everything. Thank you for carrying the weight of 353,000 people who cannot carry it themselves. They deserved better from the world. They deserved to be remembered by name, acknowledged by the nations that watched and did nothing, mourned by the civilization that produced them and then allowed them to be destroyed. The least we can do, the absolute least, is remember. May their memory be eternal. World War Memories began in October 2025 as a channel dedicated to Greek history. In just 7 months, we covered the Greek destroyer that made German command laugh until it didn't. The Italian soldiers who admitted what Greek fighters did to them. The 800 Greeks who held off 100,000 shells for 16 days. The Cretan farmers who killed 4,000 elite German paratroopers. The Greek submarine that terrorized a navy that called it obsolete. The soldier who held off the German army alone and made them salute him. The burning of Smyrna. The army that marched within 40 miles of Ankara. The election that cost Greece Constantinople. And now the genocide that the world decided not to remember. These stories needed to be told. We told them. And the world listened. Nearly 1 million views, and growing from people who never knew these stories existed until they found this channel. We are proud of every single one. Starting from our next video, what comes next is the full scope of World War II. The stories that defined the greatest conflict in human history. The 101st Airborne holding Bastogne, surrounded in the snow with no supplies and no relief coming. The German commanders who learned pattern was operational and knew it was over before the battle began. The SS divisions that met their match in the hedgerows of Normandy. The American paratroopers who jumped into darkness over France and fought their way to victory with nothing but their training and their will. D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, Midway, Iwo Jima, the moments that changed the war, and the men who lived them. The untold stories, the forgotten moments, the human confrontations that never made it into the textbooks, told with the same depth and the same verified standard that brought nearly 1 million people to this channel to learn about Greece. The standard stays exactly the same. Every fact verified, every name checked, every story told with the same care we brought to the Greek history that built this channel. If you came here for Greek history, thank you. Those videos are not going anywhere. They will keep telling the story of Greece to anyone who finds them. If you stay for what comes next, welcome to the next chapter. We started this in October with nothing but a story worth telling. Look where we are now. The stories worth telling never run out. We are just getting started.